Okay, first of all, thanks very much to the conference organisers for the invitation to speak here, so thank you very much. I just want to talk a little bit about the work of the CAROs. As David said, it's a bit of a mouthful, so we'll just say CARO from here on. And some of the actions that the local authorities are currently working on, because they're currently drafting their climate action plans. So first of all, who are CARO? Well, we were set up in 2018 to build experience within the local authority sector, to drive on with the climate actions that we need to do and build capacity, to coordinate engagement between the government departments and the local authorities, and to translate all that government policy all the way down to local authority activities, everything from playgrounds to graveyards, everything in between. So in terms of the work programme for CARO, it's management and governance of the efforts of the local authorities. It's identifying the adaptation measures and the mitigation measures that the local authorities will have to come up with for their plans. It's communication, citizen engagement, it's training and education of all the local authority staff, not just those in environment sections, but everybody in road sections, water, libraries. It's across the board, and knowledge development within the sector, and to act as a repository for that. So I'll just throw out the terms climate mitigation and adaptation. Most people don't know these, but for the 10%, including me, they constantly have to remind myself, what do we mean? Climate mitigation is about the impact we're having on the planet, what the carbon that we're putting out there and the effect that it has. Climate adaptation, if we stop putting carbon into the atmosphere tomorrow morning, we're still going to see significant change in our weather patterns for decades, and we have to brace for impact. We have to get our plans in place. So I'm going to start with a little parable that my Director of Services in Kildare used to always talk about, the Intel parable, which at the time was a water quality parable, but I think it's really a climate parable. So this is a lovely image to think about today. It's back in the winter of 2009. The country was covered in snow. It was the big freeze. And one of the big tasks that the local authorities and the national roads authorities that were at the time is to keep the roads open. How do you do that? By spreading grit and salt. And of course, the whole country ran out of it. So the decision was taken to use urea on the roads to keep them open, because they had to be kept open. And then when the big freeze or the big thaw came, all that snow and ice melted. The urea got into the River Morel, which got into the Liffey, which got into the drinking water supply for Dublin. Now, that urea, that nitrogen, was at such a low level it wasn't going to impact on drinking water quality at all. No health implications at all. But it had significant implications for the reverse osmosis plant in Intel. And it shut their plant down, and half the factory was closed for about 2 weeks. So that was a very significant impact. Not only made it into the papers, it made it into the boardroom in Intel when they're considering, where do we invest next? Are we going to stick with Kildare, or are we going to go somewhere else? And Kildare County Council, as the water authority at the time, had to put significant effort into engaging with Intel about that there was a secure, high-quality water supply in the area, and that the measures that had been taken would not happen again. So was this an adaptation, but it wasn't the right adaptation to the circumstances that we were facing? Just in terms of some of the changes that we're going through, if you haven't gone to Climate Ireland, have a look at it, especially if you're trying to engage with somebody in your management in your organisation and trying to show what the changes that we're going to face. You can zoom in on your area and see what's going to happen. So here we are in Galway. So the baseline is from back in up to 2000, from 1980 to 2000. So comparing to that baseline, we're going to have an increase of 4.5 heat waves each summer. That's more than 3 days of 95th percentile above the normal temperatures. It's far more significant in the south of the country. Down in Cork, you're talking about 6 times. In terms of dry periods, where you have more than 5 days less than 1 mil, it's going to increase by 27%. On the upside, the growing season is going to be longer. It's going to start 21 days earlier, and the grazing season is going to be 38 days longer. Now, that means there's less feed will have to be bought by farmers and things like that, but that brings its own pressures. Now, the nutrient requirements on the land are higher. What does it mean having stock on the land for longer? What pressures does that put on the catchments? On the other side, in very wet days of more than 30 mil, that's going to increase by 42%, mostly in East Galway, which already has some significant problems in terms of water management. And the other side as well, it's just like the still conditions we have today. The potential for wind energy is going to go down by about 5%. So these are all the changes that we have to look at and have to adapt with. And by the way, you can use different scenarios, and I've used the lowest scenario. You can do a worst case scenario as well. So it's a fantastic site that you should have a look at. So in terms of the context that we're operating in, we had the Climate Act back in 2015. we had the climate adaptation plans, the climate action plans, and the review of the Act requiring local authorities, among others, to come up with climate action plans. And the big picture, I suppose, to reduce the extent of further global warming, pursue and achieve by no later than the end of the year 2050 the transition to a climate resilient, biodiversity rich, environmentally sustainable and climate neutral economy. It's a big, big ask. So in terms of the local authorities, we're required to come up with climate action plans, and the approach is very much being taken. It's similar to in some ways to the county development plans. It's looking at a place-based approach to climate action. What's happening in your county? What are the measures that have to be taken in terms of adaptation and mitigation? And it's evidence-based. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we proposing what we're proposing? There has to be a firm evidence base behind what we're going to do. And it's about translating and providing strategic direction from the national policy, as I said, down to the playgrounds, to the graveyards, everything in between, all the operations that we're doing, to the workers that are on the ground implementing that. So in terms of the scope for the local authorities then, in some aspects there's full accountability in things that are under our control, and there's other areas where we're going to influence, coordinate, facilitate and also advocate. In terms of full accountability, well, that's things like our fleet management. Local authorities are the biggest fleet operators in the country in terms of vehicles, and a huge proportion of those vehicles are heavy goods vehicles, which you simply cannot electrify at the moment. In terms of our own buildings, there's a huge building stock there, public lighting, opportunities for energy gathering, how we're managing our land banks. Are we going to have pristine parks that are cut, or are we going to go for biodiversity and have our no mow may and extend that throughout the season? And also in terms of housing, there's a very significant housing stock that has to be retrofit. And what's the carbon footprint that they're putting out, and what's the carbon footprint of their construction? In terms then of areas where we can influence, coordinate and advocate, well, I suppose in terms of being a planning authority and issuing road opening licences and things like that, the rollout of charging points across the country, local authorities are going to play a vital role in facilitating that. In terms of engaging with community groups on projects like re-wetting wetlands and things like that, planning permission for energy gathering infrastructure. We're also very much involved in CARO. We're very much involved with the GA and the development of the Green Clubs programme, and of course the rollout of things like greenways. Now, how many of those people are actually commuting to work? Very few, but a lot of people get the confidence to give it a go on greenways, so they're a very, very important part of the work that's being done. So in terms of the time frame, the ministerial request was issued on the 24th of February, which means it's the 23rd of February 2024 is the deadline we have to get those plans accepted. And that means having gone through the political process of having been approved by the elected members in the local authority, having gone through the Strategic Policy Committee on Environment, having passed through management, having gone through public consultation. There's a lot of stages. So we're probably looking at people that will have local authorities that will be going out to public consultation near the end of the summer. And then once those plans are in place, there's a 5-year programme to implement them up to 2029. So in terms of preparing for those climate actions, we've done a lot of training with local authorities, and we've also had stakeholder engagement workshops as well. We've had one on heritage and biodiversity, on transport, on planning and built environment, on economic and community development, and we had one as well on land use, or water and agriculture. So we had all the key players in the room on the day, and we had a lot of local authority staff as well. The key staff stayed where they were, and the local authority staff rotated through the table. So we were in effect asking the same questions 5 times over to get a consistency and potential actions that we could take. So the consensus from the workshop, and you've heard all this morning already, you can't tackle climate action without tackling water, and that was from Conor Quinn in the EPA. The crossover and the challenges is huge. The co-benefits of the solutions are huge. So we've got to frame climate actions that deliver on both these issues, climate and water. So the other consensus, the word resources, I thought I was going to have a swear box on the day to stop people using the word, and I actually didn't. I think people recognise we have to get on with this, and waiting for the resources to come. Of course we need them, but we have to get on with things as well. There was about 5 times as many adaptation measures identified as mitigation measures. I suppose it's easy to, in some ways, to identify the problems that we're having rather than come up with some of the issues for reducing our carbon footprint. And a lot of the low-hanging fruit is already gone in terms of, retrofitting public lighting, fleet management. A lot of these things have already been identified and there are programmes already in place. There's huge crossover in our roles. We have to try and break down the silos, share data effectively, make sure that we're not double jobbing, coordinate the work that we're doing, and even draft service level agreements between organisations to make sure that when we promise something, it's going to be delivered in a timely manner so that we can depend on each other. So just looking at some of the issues that were identified. So say, for example, in terms of private supplies, group water schemes and small private supplies, if we have a sustained period of hot weather, water levels are dropping and boreholes are affected, we may have to start tankering out water to small group water schemes or even schools and things like that. What capacity do we have for tankering water? I suppose that we're in an evolving area where the local authority's role has been taken on by Uisce Éireann. How many tankers are still within the local authority sector? In terms of firefighting, the fire services, we're getting milder winters with much more growth of vegetation. And come the spring, the fires that are happening, wildfires are more severe. How much water is available to fight those fires when we get there? Is there a group water scheme with a good yield? Is there a local river? What kind of flow is that going to be in? Again, what's the tankering capacity in the fire service? What's the level of training among the fire service personnel to operate this equipment effectively? These are all the things we're going to have to check. And bearing in mind as well, small private supplies are very important. We're talking about schools and things like that. So a remote school with a borehole, it could be a small cottage industry, 4 or 5 people that are working there, which is the heart of the local enterprise offices, the kind of industry that we're trying to encourage. It can be small, little B&Bs and hotels and things like that. So these are critical infrastructure to the rural economy that we have to protect. So in terms of some of the measures that we identified in terms of adaptation, well, first of all, it's update the registers of group water schemes and small private supplies. Local authorities are the supervisory authority for private water supplies in the regulations. And the first thing that's in there is you shall establish and maintain a register. Now, I put it to you, if you look at the Focus on Private Supplies report that the EPA put out, you'll see some local authorities have hundreds and some local authorities they're in single digits. So a lot of these registers simply are not fit for purpose in terms of what's there. Once we've identified and make sure that we've got a good register, well, risk assessing those supplies and how secure are they in the long term. Then assessing the potential measures to be taken. Is it, do you need to consolidate schemes? In some areas, do you just have to prepare to tanker if there's going to be an issue? Determine the intervention criteria. If it's a commercial operation that's having a problem and they're short of water, do we intervene? If it's a public school that's having an issue, do we intervene? We can't solve all the problems, so we have to come up with, decide where we're going to put the resources and what those resource implications are, what funding mechanisms will be available for central government, and then also awareness with the stakeholders that are operating these group water schemes and the small private supplies as well. In terms then of mitigation measures, okay, we're doing good things, but are we doing them the right way? So in terms of sampling and checking the water quality, can we coordinate with other state agencies that are already sampling some of these supplies? And in certain cases, because of GDPR, some state agencies that are also taking water quality samples are not sharing data. And so when you consider the carbon footprint of going out and taking all these samples and then not sharing the information, it's not on. Examining the travel and the fleet. Can we electrify the vehicles that we're using for taking samples from both sampling staff and engineering staff that are going out and looking at these supplies? The efficiency of the lab. These buildings have to be kept between 18 and 22 degrees Celsius. I'd love to be there right now. So the energy consumption on some of these laboratories in the local authorities is very significant. And the resource and circularity of lab materials. Some samples where you're taking, you could be using 16 bottles, and they will not be recycled because of quality assurance. Can we change that? Can we examine ways to do that? And then in terms of the water and energy conservation measures within the group water schemes and those small private supplies themselves, education and supports for the sector there. In terms then of the water quality and the Water Framework Directive, again, if we're getting low rainfall, do we need to stress test all the discharge licences that we have out there? There's the Section 4 discharge licences that local authorities would issue. They're all built on assumptions of the assimilative capacity of rivers on the 95th percentiles. If those are falling, do all those discharge licences have to be re-examined? Is the capacity still there to absorb the contaminants that we're putting in? Then in terms of high rainfall, stormwater overflows and runoff from agriculture is going to increase, and that could lead to increased risks for drinking water abstractions and also increased risk for bathing waters. We see it every time during summers. You get heavy torrential short downfall. It can have a very significant impact on bathing water quality. Again, in terms of the mitigation of the activities that we're doing. How do we minimise the carbon footprint of what we're doing in Water Framework Directive? Well, again, examining the sampling and fleet options. So I mean, the report that was issued today, a large proportion of the samples that are feed into that report are taken by local authority staff. So in my own local authority, probably about 10,000 kilometres of mileage is required to gather those samples for County Cork. Can we use more telemetry and less samples? Do we have to sample as often as we are? As scientists, we always have data needs versus data wants. What do we actually need? And again, in terms of the energy efficiency of the laboratories that we're using. And rationalising the chain of samples. Okay, in some circumstances, samples will be taken by local authority staff. They'll be brought back to a laboratory which is ISO accredited, meets all the intercalibration methods for the laboratories, and are then packaged up and go on a journey to labs all over the country where they could be analysed locally, which they were in the past. And again, the carbon footprint of all those journeys, it all adds up. We're doing good things, but are we doing them the right way? So again, just back to the time frame, 23rd of February 2024 is the deadline that we have to meet. So if you have somebody from a local authority getting on to you looking for data or information and they're sounding stressed, be kind, we're under pressure. There's no provision in the legislation whatsoever for the Minister to even extend the deadline. It's absolutely set, so we have to meet it. So thank you very much for your time and happy to take any questions.